I just gave you my take on this week's events in China. I wanted to bring in Anne Applebaum to hear hers. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, a staff writer for The Atlantic, and she has been warning for years about this very alliance of autocracies and their growing diplomatic and financial ties. Her most recent book, Autocracy, Inc., has just been released in paperback. Anne, welcome. So, as I say, you've been talking about this alliance. When you watched those pictures of Kim, of Xi, and of Putin, what strikes you as what keeps them together? Because there is fundamentally the shared opposition to a Western-led world and American power, right? Is there more to it?
No, I think that's exactly the point. These are powers that have very different ideologies: nationalist, communist, theocratic in the case of Iran, which is sometimes part of this group. What unites them is their dislike of us. And by us, I mean the democratic world, the language of rule of law, the language of transparency, the language of accountability, because of course that's the language of their own internal oppositions. And China and Russia in particular, but the rest as well, have been working for many years to delegitimize that language, to get the idea of human rights, for example, out of international documents, international institutions, and instead promote an idea that using the word sovereignty, which by the way is a word that the Trump administration also uses, by which they mean no one can criticize us, and we get to decide what happens inside our own countries, and also if we feel like invading other countries, nobody can object.
And, you know, again, to me, the surprise was to see the Indias, the Egypts, the Turkeys, Indonesia sent very high-level representatives. It does feel like all of these countries are, in some way or the other, dismayed by America and what they had thought of was a reliable America has gone.
So America was a predictable power. It stood for long-term investment. It stood for a set of rules and institutions, which if you liked them or didn't like them, at least they were predictable. And now the United States is seen as unpredictable. And the president is whimsical. He might change his mind at any minute. It's very dangerous to go and see him in the Oval Office because he might attack you. I know of foreign leaders who've avoided going for that reason. And so the idea that if you want stability and you want security, then it looks to a lot of countries that are not necessarily autocracies themselves. It looks like maybe you need a good relationship with Russia and China. And it's also a form of hedging. If the United States falls through, well, then we're going to need some other friends.
Right. And, you talk about the way I see it is there's this geopolitical balancing against American power, but there's also an ideological balancing against democracy, the rule of law, and things like that. Do you think, are we returning to almost a Cold War-like situation where there are countries now that are increasingly standing in opposition to, liberal democratic values, international rules of law, things like that?
Yes, although it's even more tricky than the Cold War, because the opponents of liberal democracy are also inside liberal democracies. And there is a clear alignment between the German far right, the American far right, the British far right, and sometimes with Russians and with others in the autocratic world. And they are also seeking to undermine liberal democracy. So it's not as straightforward. It's not like there's one block of Democrats versus one block of autocrats. It's actually a more complicated picture.
And the right-wing populists in one country support those in others. So I look at Trump, and what is his anger with South Africa? It's about the treatment of white farmers. Or you look at what he's doing in Poland, where he's reaching in and celebrating and feting the president of Poland, who is a titular figure, doesn't have that much political power, because he's a right-wing ally, right?
Yeah, but you can see that in other countries as well. I mean, there's favoritism shown to Nigel Farage, favoritism shown to the AFD. That's more by J.D. Vance.
Bolsonaro in Brazil, right?
Well, Bolsonaro in Brazil is actually almost an extreme case, because you have the U.S. actually sanctioning Brazil because Brazil has its own political system and its own rule of law, and it's punished its equivalent of January the 6th, an uprising to overthrow the election. The Brazilians have continued to punish the people responsible for it. And the Trump administration is now angry at Brazil for doing that.
How do Poles react to the president, in effect, picking a side in a domestic political debate?
I mean, it would depend which side of the political spectrum you're on. I mean, I think that's true in almost every country. You know, that the effect of a U.S. intervention in a democratic country is really further polarization, because it makes, you know, it just divides people more deeply.
That's a very important point, that it's more complicated than the Cold War, because the enemies of liberal democracy are now both outside and within.
Yes, but I should also say that people who admire and want liberal democracy are also on the other side. There is an Iranian opposition, there is a Russian opposition, there's even a Chinese opposition, and they also have relationships with one another, and they are also interested in changing their own governments or in changing. So it's not as if they're, you know, even Russia is a clear picture either.
That's a nice uplifting note to end on, Anne Applebaum. Thank you so much. The book, Autocracy Inc., is in paperback, as with everything you write. It's fantastic.